I used to be Christian. My mother was Catholic and my father was secular. I went to a Church of England school and learned the basics of Christian belief. However, with there being so many belief systems, I asked myself a question. How did I know I was born into the correct one? Would I have been something different if I was born and raised elsewhere? I then studied every belief, claim, or worldview I could find to discover the ultimate explanation for all things. In doing so, I found that many explanations couldn't account for many things that I could observe or prove themselves false or fell apart due to their own self-contradictions or contradictions between what they say and reality. For example, I encountered Trinitarian Christianity, which argues that God is both one and three, and that the infinite, immortal God is also a finite, mortal man. I encountered polytheists who argued that there are many gods, some eternal, some who popped out of nothing, who are all infinite but have created and finite human or animal forms, suffer ignorance, tiredness, and even injury. Some Pacific Island religions consider volcanoes who created their island and whose sediments make the ground highly fertile for cultivation to be also eternal and divine. I've also found that many atheistic positions are not any more special or more coherent than these. For example, many materialistic worldviews argue that the universe which we see, which is finite, limited, and changing, is also somehow infinite and eternal at the same time. You just can't see it. Other atheist positions argue that the universe ultimately popped out of nothing, albeit with precisely measured amounts of energy, but no cause to determine that measure. Of course, there are also atheistic worldviews like types of Buddhism, which goes to show that atheism doesn't preclude spirituality, just God. When I encountered Islam, I found something different. That Islam describes God as a being of infinite or inexhaustible power and who possesses intentionality or will. He has no human or animal attributes, forms, natures, or appetites. Islam teaches that God is genderless, does not experience tiredness or ignorance, and exists without peer. Surah Ikhlas of the Quran makes clear, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Qul huwa Allahu ahad. Say God is one, Allahu samad. The self-sufficient, lam yalid wa lam yulad. He does not reproduce, nor was he reproduced. Wa lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad. There is nothing like him, which means he is without partner, because if there were other infinite gods, they would all limit each other and all would not be infinite or gods at all. This is the Islamic concept of God, a pure indivisible oneness, a cause and initiator for all things, a divine unity behind the multitude of created things. And it is the only explanation that is without contradictions and circular reasoning and does not need to appeal to any mystery to hide faults it simply doesn't have. Islam's message to mankind is to avoid the error of mixing the infinite and the finite together and creating false idols by attributing to limited and finite things the attributes that belong only to the Creator and vice versa. Instead, Islam asks mankind to recognize the infinite alone as the ultimate creator of all things, who is separate from his creation and not like it. Is this a God peculiar to Islam? No. Anyone on earth today or in history who worships an infinite, unlimited creator who willed all things into existence and does not resemble any finite things or creatures, worships the same God we do, whatever religion they call themselves. Islam teaches that it is not something new, but merely a reiteration of the same message that has been repeatedly sent down to mankind throughout different times and places, producing commonalities in many religions throughout history. Now to the title of the debate, Islam explains reality better than atheism. Some might say, well, atheism doesn't seek to explain anything. It's only a lack of belief of God or a rejection thereof. But atheism's denial of the existence of God carries the minimum corollary, that reality is completely explainable without God. And they'd be wrong in my estimation. There are four aspects of reality that only Islam's concept of God can ultimately and soundly explain, while atheism cannot do so without falling into self-contradiction. And these aspects are change, matter, finitude, and specificity. Atheism rejects the only sound explanation for change. If this moment depended on an infinite number of previous moments and movements, we'd never exist or get here. If I were to say that my opponents can begin their speech after an infinite amount of time, they would never have the chance to start their speeches, as an infinite amount of time can't end or even begin if you think about it. Likewise, if I asked a poor student, not pointing to anyone in particular, for £1 and he didn't have it, and he asked another who was equally poor, and so on, I'd never get that £1 until the chain of students found at least one student who had £1 to begin the chain of lending and eventually get to me. Now, this is known as the infinite regress fallacy, which is the same as asserting a beginning and no beginning at the same time. It is a contradiction and therefore impossible. The existence of change and movement requires a first mover. There's no way around that. And if it is the first mover, it means it chose to move things without being moved by anything else. Therefore, it has a will. This is the key characteristic of God, whose name is Al-Mubdi, in the initiator in the Quran. 2. Atheism rejects the only sound explanation for the ultimate basis behind matter. If matter gets its attributes and characteristics because it is made from something more fundamental than it, let's just say subatomic particles and forces, ultimately quarks and bosons, and these things are made of, let's say, quantum vacuum energy or fluctuations in such thing, or superstrings, one or the other for the sake of argument, what is quantum vacuum energy, or what are superstrings, if they even exist, made of? If something else, and that's made of something else, where does it stop? If it has no end, then nothing would exist. It's like saying a branch is held aloft from the ground by an infinitely tall tree, or a pond has no bottom to hold up the water, despite the water being at a specific level. The fact that anything exists and continues to exist proves there must be something fundamental that is supporting all these things, that itself isn't made of anything else and has no parts, and therefore is self-sustaining. The Quran calls God Ar-Razzaq, the sustainer, Al-Hafidh, the preserver, Al-Samad, the self-sufficient. 3. Atheism rejects the only sound explanation for finite things. If something has size, shape, charge, or a specific characteristic, what determined these limitations in the first place? If it were determined by a finite thing outside itself, an efficient cause, going on forever, it's an infinite regress fallacy. If it was determined by the building blocks inside itself, a material cause going on forever into smaller and smaller blocks, it's another infinite regress fallacy. The only possibility left is that all forms and limited characteristics of all finite things were ultimately created by something that has no finite limitations itself, i.e. something infinite, which has no limits that need determining by something else, and therefore is the ultimate or necessary thing. And it creates all other things. The Quran calls God Al-Khaliq, the creator. 4. Atheism rejects the only sound explanation for the specificity of finite things. Things in the universe, including the magnitude of the forces of gravity, strong, weak, and force, and electromagnetism, and the amount of energy contained in the universe, are specific to a certain magnitude, size, quantity, and quality. Considering that the universe could have one quark more than it has, the question is, what determined it would be one way and not another? Perhaps the conditions prior to the universe's emergence, shall we say, led to the conditions we see now. But this only shifts the burden of explanation further along the chain. What then determined the precise pre-existing conditions before the universe that led to our universe being the way it is? If we invoke an infinite chain of pre-existing conditions to explain our current condition or the emergence of the universe, this is yet again another infinite regress fallacy, I'm afraid. The only remaining explanation is that something ultimately chose or determined by its will all things to be the way they are. The Quran calls God Al-Musawwir, the shaper. Islam posits that God ultimately created and sustained all things. He is infinite, unlimited, and self-sustaining, and He alone measured out the numbers of things and apportioned all the regularities, or what you call natural laws, behind all things. It is the Islamic concept of God that not only explains reality better than atheism, but it is the only explanation ultimately that can explain reality that we see, which does not possess self-contradictions, circular logics, or appeals to mystery or blind faith. The arguments of atheists, in my experience, are no different to those I've encountered from polytheists, Trinitarians, or volcano worshippers. Atheists just call their God the universe, which essentially is just a bigger volcano. Thank you.